Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. On April 8th, the National Housing Conference hosted its annual Solutions for Housing Communications convening at the National Press Club, bringing together housing experts, policymakers, journalists, and thought leaders to discuss effective strategies for increasing public understanding of the importance of affordable housing. In today's episode, we revisit the panel, Communicating Before, During, and After a Natural Disaster, where experts explored how housing communicators can clearly and credibly help the public understand risk, respond to crises, and navigate recovery. To view the conversation in its entirety, and other sessions from Solutions for Housing Communications, visit nhc.org.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marion McFadden. I'll be moderating today's session. We're going to be talking about disasters. It's been a long day. We've covered a lot of ground, but we haven't really gotten to the big issues of the day as we look at the increasing impact of disasters on communities. So I'm going to first ask our panelists to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about what they do, and then we'll break it into before, during, and after disasters.
Thanks, Marion. Hi, everybody. Michael Newman. I'm the General Counsel at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, or IBHS. We are a 501c3 funded by the property insurance industry. And I can almost guarantee I work for one of the coolest organizations in the room because we crash test buildings. We've got a 90-acre facility in South Carolina where we recreate the perils of wind, rain, hail, and wildfire. And by recreate, I mean we can blow 130-mile-an-hour winds. We can create a wildfire ember storm in a contained way. And we use that recreated severe weather to test the resilience of the built environment at full scale. So we build houses, we build commercial buildings, and then we beat the heck out of them with realistic forces of nature so we can identify the vulnerabilities. And then more importantly, so we can identify the mitigation actions to close those vulnerabilities. And we're looking for mitigation actions that are effective, that are affordable, and that are achievable. And we do that because we want our built environment, we want our homes, our communities, and our businesses to be survivable and insurable. Survivable means simply that our buildings can withstand the severe weather we know they're going to face. And insurable means that our buildings are more attractive to the property insurance industry. So I am not a communications specialist. I am a lawyer. I lead teams on public policy and our private sector engagement and on building codes, which means that while I'm not a communications specialist, I sure do have to communicate all the time about these issues, saying things people don't always want to hear. So I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Jessie.
My name is Jessie Handforth Kome. I'm a director at CohnReznick in the Government and Public Sector Advisory. But my main part of my career was spent at HUD. I retired in January 2024 as the director of the Office of Block Grant Assistance. We're working on the Community Development Block Grant Program, and I came up through the disaster recovery line of business that grew up to be CDBG, Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. I worked on 9/11 and Katrina and Sandy and Maria and Harvey and Oklahoma City and a lot of other disasters and floods. And I have seen some epic communication fails and a few successes. So I think I'm on this panel so I can talk to you about what really doesn't work and what could work in communications. But my background is actually as a city and regional planner and economist.
And I do want to assure everyone, since we got the last spot of the day, we will be talking about the horror stories of what not to do.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angie Garling. I'm the Senior Vice President for Early Care and Education at the Low Income Investment Fund. Also not a communication specialist, but communicate every day, all the time, and think a lot about how to do that well. I oversee childcare work. We are a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution, but deeply, deeply invested and committed, not just to low-income housing, but also to early care and education. So we've invested over $672 million, impacting over 434,000 children, thinking about either home-based businesses that operate as childcare businesses and also childcare centers. So we help take money from governments or banks and we repurpose it for grants or loans to childcare facilities and then also low-income housing. And I'm here to talk about some of our disaster response work that we've done, particularly in Los Angeles with the fires a year ago.
And I should say I'm a lawyer by training, so we are all untrained communications professionals who've learned it the hard way. So happy to share our stories with you. So let's start by thinking about how we communicate risk to communities. You want to start, Michael?
Sure. Let me start by saying it's hard, and we're not particularly good at it. Part of my job is communicating two things that are incredibly hard. One is science, and the other is risk. Communicating science is a tremendous challenge if you're not Bill Nye the Science Guy, because you have to take really complicated subjects, break it down into something simple enough to be understandable, but still maintain credibility. And frankly, at IBHS, it's a big part of what we spend our time thinking about. And sometimes we hit the mark and sometimes we miss the mark. And we're constantly shifting our message to different audiences because you have to speak differently to different audiences. And in any given room, you might have multiple audiences that you have to speak to. And then there's the communication of risk. I don't know if it's humans or Americans, it's certainly American humans, don't like thinking about rainy days. We don't like thinking about long-term issues, and we're not particularly good at conceptualizing risk. And so I think that's a challenge for all of us, for the insurance industry, for the housing sector, for the resilience space, for the disaster recovery space. How do we encourage people to make decisions that are informed by risk when they don't like thinking about risk? It's a really hard challenge.
So, Jessie, let me ask you that question about how do we get the attention from a community scale planning aspect?
If you're working in a disaster environment, post-disaster, and you're trying to do planning, you're dealing with people who are in typically they're very stressed and they're in amygdala hijacked, right? They're fight, flight, flee, fib, flop, fawn, all of the Fs, right? And so trying to talk to them about lifting your eyes over the horizon and doing a community plan, coming in as a federal advisor, or even as a consultant, you have to say, look, I don't know your community. You know your community. Does your community expect you to be the strong technicians, to make the decisions, and just go with it and tell them after the fact? Or does your community expect you to come ask them what they want and build consensus and engagement? By the way, America, door 2 is the door. And then make decisions and move. How much time do you have? And we've seen one of the big mistakes I saw was long ago in Grand Forks, North Dakota, they had 94, 5, 6, 7% of the city flooded while the downtown burned down. It was on CNN for more than 5 days with helicopters circling the burning tall buildings. And the mayor was a hero in disaster response. She was an absolute hero. And then got thrown out of office when she tried to run the recovery as a strong technician running it and didn't switch to, we're going to have to live with this for 20 to 50 years. So what do you want, community? How do you want to recover? You have to read the room and take an engagement and communications path and reassess when conditions change, when you get a year out, maybe you need to change what you're doing. It's tricky. From a planning perspective, planners lead toward more engagement, but then the risk that everybody feels after disaster is we need to recover right now, which isn't possible, and somebody has to communicate that. And the planning process helps with that.
Okay, Angie, let's take it to the community level, community cohesion. How should we be supporting communities to prepare themselves for disasters when they're not thinking about it the sunny days?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like many communities, particularly in childcare, they may not even think of themselves as a business. They think of themselves as serving the community and providing a service. For example, if you take Los Angeles, in Los Angeles County, there are over 7,300 childcare providers. If you're thinking about them as a sector, they are often not as organized. One of the reasons we had an advantage after the fires is that we had pre-existing relationships with these childcare providers. And that's, of course, you can't always do that, but I would recommend, like in your communities, have connections with these providers. They are probably some of the best prepared, not necessarily long-term, but in a drill. Like they are required by the state licensors to do a monthly disaster drill. So the kids know about it, they know how to get the kids out, and they're also in touch with their families more often than many other community resources are. They see those families twice a day, which is often even more than schools were. So we find that childcare is not only necessarily not as well plugged in at the beginning, but they're often not as contacted after a disaster happens when they should be. And so there's a lot of recommendations we have about how they can be better connected all along the way. In communities, we found after the LA fires, we surveyed providers that they were vastly uninsured or underinsured. So that's a huge one, is just thinking about how they can be better prepared ahead of time. And you're right, it's hard to think about every single type of disaster that could potentially happen. But so many of them who lost their homes will have a really hard time rebuilding because they weren't insured for replacement cost. Think of folks like childcare providers as a sector. Think about how they can either buy into insurance plans or other things that they can do to be better prepared. And then, after disaster happens, how can you communicate with them and help meet their needs for what they need?
I think you're pulling on something really important, Angie, which is there is a range of actions that people can take, from the mundane to the financial to the structural, that families, that businesses, and that communities can and perhaps should be taking before the bad day happens. IBHS puts out guidance every year as the seasons change, as the perils change. How many of you, I can't really see anybody, but show of hands, how many of you know to close interior doors in your home before a storm comes through? Yeah, more than I expected, actually. Yeah. So that's just one example of many of a mundane action. Oh, there's a big severe convective storm system coming through DC, as happened a few weeks ago. Before I left the house that day, I closed every interior door in my home. That came because of my job, frankly. But that's a type of risk communication that we all need to do a better job of. And I would put that in the education piece. We're not really asking anyone to make any major life decisions. We're just asking them to learn some basic tips that can help. And then the larger, more financial decisions of, am I going to put a new roof on my house? Am I going to invest, if it's the western part of the country, in really working on my defensible space to protect my home or my building from embers associated with wildfires? And then there's the more structural piece at the community level of, do we want to invest in the klaxon horns like Kirk County didn't have, that there's a flash flood coming? So there's a set of different decisions that can be made from individuals to businesses to communities, and they all require different levels of education, and that education then has to be tinged with an understanding of risk. All of which is to say it's hard. And I think that's going to be our refrain up here today. But I wanted to pull that thread of, it's really a range of things before the bad day that we're trying to impart on families, on businesses, and on whole communities.
But in that range of things, social cohesion is unbelievably critical.
Yeah.
We know this from the most common disasters, heat waves. Research out of Chicago years ago showed that researchers know that there were two neighborhoods, one where a lot of elders died, and one where they didn't. And the neighborhoods looked similar on a lot of data dimensions. But when they checked, people knocked on doors in one neighborhood and people lived, and they didn't knock on doors, they didn't have social cohesion, and people died. So it really matters. For each and every one of you, one of the big things you can do for risk reduction is go bowling with friends, have connections to your church, be connected, have people care where you are, how you're doing, and also go check on your neighbors, get to know them. And, America is making itself more and more and more at risk because people aren't doing that as much. And it really, really shows in disaster recoveries. I can promise you, more cohesive places recover better and more of the people recover, regardless of income, if they're more connected to each other. And childcare can see that, their tip of the spear on that.
And I would just add to that, make sure everyone's loading up their phones with their contacts, with their apps, however they connect with their families and with their neighbors, because your actual stuff may be lost in the disaster. You may only have time to grab your phone.
Right.
And then also from a political perspective, you want to think about who are the members of Congress, who is the mayor, who are the other elected officials that you should really have their chief of staff in your phone if you're a major employer in the area,
right,
or you have a lot of residents in affordable housing, for example. So let's talk about some of the problems during disasters. I know that language issues can be some of the deadliest problems we've ever seen in terms of people getting an alert and not understanding what it means. So Angie, Jessie, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say, again, I feel like the theme for me is have as much contact with folks ahead of time and understand what resources the community already has. In childcare, not only are they required to take every single contact number of every family of the children that are in their care with them when they leave for a disaster. So they know how to get in touch with all of those parents. And they know how to get in touch with them in the language that they speak. Those relationships and those language capacities are established beforehand. So whatever you can do to ensure that you know what language they speak, make sure they have updated emergency contacts. All of those are required by licensing for these childcare providers. So they really do focus and serve as community anchors. And the other thing I'll talk about in a moment is the fact that childcare takes place in centers, but it also takes place in family childcare homes or in people's homes, mostly women's homes. In Los Angeles, half of the programs that were destroyed were centers and half were family childcare homes. In family childcare homes, they often tend to have a better language match with the families. So they often are speaking the language of the families. And knowing what resources are available to do immediate translation, I think are also really good to have to make sure that people know what those are.
I can give an example of after Katrina, our office had got a letter from the Department of Justice, which is a pretty routine letter, that just said, you're going to have to provide translation in these languages, in these locations. And one of them was that we had to do translation in Vietnamese for the city of New Orleans and for surrounding parishes. And so we went and told the state of Louisiana, and we don't know what you're talking about. How can there be 12,000 Vietnamese households, or I think that was the number, in New Orleans and us not know? I said, I don't know, but you're going to have to translate into Vietnamese. And so they went off to make contact, and they talked, and it turned out the city did know. And it turned out that they were there, and they were Montagnards who had come after the French left Vietnam, and they had been resettled partially by the Catholic Church in New Orleans. I don't know the whole history, although I've been told it several times. And the next day, Louisiana called us back, and they said, well, we'll translate into Vietnamese, but our Vietnamese speak French. And they've been talking to the French speakers on our translation lines. So all that to say that what you think you know from data and what you know on the ground is where real communications happens, right? Louisiana knew, they did what was legally required, but they also put together a communications strategy and a translation strategy that met the people that they actually had. But it helped that they were told to go look.
And I would say on translation strategy, we know that AI has come a long way, but we have seen some real problems during and after disasters when folks are just relying on Google Translate. So it's definitely an area where we encourage jurisdictions in particular to invest in real translation,
right?
Those life or death communications. Any thoughts on reaching disabled populations and making sure that evacuations can be safe?
It's really hard. You have to plan in advance. There's just no way to meet most special needs populations unless you know before the disaster that they're there. And all of us that were watching the coverage after Katrina sort of know that there were just huge misses and misunderstandings of, like, do you have refrigerators for insulin at intervals along the evacuation routes? Do you have accessible public transportation, and a lot of it, enough of it? You just need to know who is in your community and plan ahead. For the long-term recovery, it's one of the biggest arguments for doing serious outreach through all different kinds of organizations. Again, to find out who's recovering, who's going to be there, what the needs are. Once, when I was working in North Carolina, I was working with a community who was recovering, and they had a major VA hospital that did rehab, human rehab, learning how to deal with being amputees and things like that. And like almost every housing unit had to have a ramp. And just driving around, I'd spotted there were a lot of ramps. So I asked the community, and the state, is this a really high disability area? And they didn't know, but they figured it out really, really fast. And it mattered for the recovery because you had to cost that in. Not just for some houses, like 20% of the houses, but for it was like 70% or 80% had to be seriously accessible, not just accessible ready.
If I can add another class of people, it's not a protected class, but it's one that probably includes some of us in here. That's the stubborn class of people.
They're trouble.
Yeah. They're people who just ignore the order to evacuate.
Yeah.
And if I can put in a plug, the more people can rely on passive mitigation, which is to say they've invested the time and the resources ahead of the bad day, ahead of the wildfire, ahead of the storm, to have, let's say you're living in coastal Mississippi. If you have the fortified roof, if you have the impact-resistant windows, you may be less inclined to be boarding up your windows with plywood up to the moment of the storm. If you've done the work to make your defensible space safer, to remove anything combustible, the green stuff or the brown stuff, anything that can burn from the 5 feet around your home, if you've got ember-resistant mesh in all of your vents, you may be less inclined to be standing on your roof with a gardening hose, hoping that that's going to somehow keep the embers and the flames away from your home. The stubborn class is tough, but if we can do more ahead of time so that our homes and our neighborhoods and our communities are hardened against severe weather, hopefully the more reasonable family members can whisper in the stubborn one's ears and say, hey, we did this ahead of time. We got to go. And hopefully we won't lose quite so many lives when these storms come through, when these wildfires come through.
But it's an interesting communications issue about how you sell it to people to do it beforehand. And it typically isn't so that you'll just have one bad day after a disaster and then you'll be fine. You'll dust off. You're not going to actually have a disaster. It's not a disaster if your house doesn't come down and you still have water and power. That's just a big storm or a flood. It's a disaster if your world comes apart and your community comes apart. But what you can tell people is now that insurers are awake and starting to pull out of areas where they're worried or jacking the prices up, you can say, if you do this resilient fortified roof, your insurance will come down. You can get insured. And by the way, you'll also only have one bad day after a disaster. The communication strategy in advance is about making you more resilient day to day and also, saving you money. And then when the disaster comes, you just have one bad day. If you try to sell the resilient roof based on there might be a storm 5 years from now that takes your whole house down, that doesn't work. It particularly doesn't work for low and moderate income people. It's so you can get insured and you have to stay here and your family's here. That one is going to work better.
And I would say, well, first of all, from childcare perspective, infants are not mobile. So again, licensing requires, so maybe my point here is to say, require your community members to be forced to think about it on a regular basis, whether they're practicing an exit, following through with a disaster plan, just making sure that for childcare, it's like they have to do it on a regular basis, so they're always thinking about it. If you have babies, you put multiple babies in a crib that has wheels and you wheel. And I don't know if you've seen those iconic photos from either Oklahoma or 9/11 with those childcare providers. It's amazing, some of the many heroines of those disasters pushing those children out on strollers because they knew and they were trained for what they needed to do.
Okay, let's move into communicating after disasters. There used to be a lot of chatter about what's emergency response, what's long-term recovery. I used to joke, long-term recovery is when people stop blaming the disaster for their pain and they start blaming the government for not helping them more quickly. We have seen more and more really large disasters happening, and I think it's no longer possible for communities to say that couldn't possibly happen here. So let's talk about things we've learned from long-term recovery. And Angie, I'd love to start with you and your recent experience in California.
Yeah, so I wanted to say a little bit about what happened. So at the Low Income Investment Fund, one of the main things we do is we help childcare providers with their facilities. So we were helping the state of California manage a $350 million program called the Infrastructure Grant Program, which was giving grants to childcare providers to repair, renovate, acquire, or improve their childcare programs. And that could be a home or it could be a center. And we had already given several of these grants out in Los Angeles, and then the fires hit, and several of our providers actually lost the brand new renovation that we had had. We had pre-existing relationships with the providers, so afterwards, many of these folks, they lost their business, they lost their home because their home and their business were the same thing. We knew who these folks were, and we worked with the state to get the folks who were not our grantees to also respond to us. So we surveyed them and asked them what did they need. In the meantime, we were also talking to funders, and we ended up raising about $1 million of private money, flexible money. So that was also very helpful. And some of that more structured government funding might be coming later. For example, the governor has put $11.5 million in his budget, which hopefully will stay in, to put more money into the childcare providers who lost their homes. There's a couple of statistics here that talked about there were 40 programs that were completely destroyed, 23 centers and 17 family childcare programs. When you think about childcare, it's the workforce of the workforce. They're the ones that enable families to go to work. So we really needed to make sure that these childcare providers could come back online so they could start serving families in the community again. So I just wanted to show you pictures of 3 home-based providers. All 3 of these providers were lifelong Altadena residents. As many of you know, Altadena is a historically Black community. Generations of Black families had lived there. And these 3 women, Altadena Clark Family Childcare, and the 2 other women, they had been serving families in their homes for many, many years. And when they were displaced, the business and the childcare provider was also displaced, right? So families couldn't take their children to this childcare anymore. And then just to compound things, because this is a very family-oriented community, most of these childcare providers, their family members lost their homes as well. Like in Clark Family Childcare, their parents lived next door and they lost their home as well. So this is a multi-family trauma. And you can see before pictures, and then pictures of the disaster. This Clark Family Childcare provider, she said, we definitely could not have done it without LIIF support, and we're looking forward to greater things ahead. So you can see they were able to identify an alternative place to do their childcare. It's a little further away in Sylmar, so not as accessible for the families. But one of the big things that we learned, where I would say if we had talked to you all beforehand, we probably might have figured this out. We raised this money because we were like, this is going to go towards rebuilding. Well, that is so much further out than we, had planned for. So really, it's about recovery. So how can we help you get into a different building in a nearby community, but continue to serve children? This is Williams Family Childcare. You can see some of down in the left is the original program, and they had been serving families for many, many years. And then you can see immediately after the disaster and then after the site had been cleared. Ms. Beasley's Family Childcare here, you can see the children beforehand, what the fire had done, and then the cleared site at the bottom. Many of these family childcare providers, they knew the families in their community, they had been working in the community, and they were able to continue to serve some of the families, but not as many. For example, the first one that I told you, she was able to find a center. So her licensing was able to pivot to say, instead of working in a home, you can operate in a center. Well, $6,000 a month rent. In addition, she's paying rent on temporary home that she's in. The costs to keeping some of these services online are astronomical. So for Ms. Beasley actually rented her home and she didn't have renter's insurance. She was completely out of luck with all of those materials that are in her childcare. We did site visits. We met with the providers, and many of these providers we already knew. And I think that's another thing that was so important that the other panelists have said is you really want to know the people that you're working with. That actually really helped, that we were the folks going in because we had worked with them. And many of them had said some of the other more traditional emergency response folks either didn't respond in time, or did not understand the sector, how it worked, how their finances were impacted, and things like that.
Could you talk a little bit about the timing of helping people make decisions to enter into new leases or find opportunities to move? Because I know there's often a really human pull to want to put things back the way they were, but that's clearly not possible.
We wanted to respond as quickly as we could, but we weren't able to establish the fund and get our first funder until April. So the fires were in January. We established the fund in April. We're still giving out grants. We've given out almost $1 million to 25 different providers, mostly in just $50,000 chunks. But some of that has been really helpful. We provide the grant, but then we also provide some of that advice of maybe you shouldn't continue to lease this, and maybe you will need to get brand new families if you're going to move, 30 miles away. You shouldn't expect those families to continue to come in a disaster. And I think in our prep session, one of you talked about how many families don't ever come back. That's important advice for local businesses to understand, that you might be serving 18 children now, but you might only get 8 back, because families need to make decisions very quickly about who's going to be serving and caring for their children. So I think just making sure that the people who are doing this direct work and providing these grants, like the folks on our team, we had 5 people going out and doing this, making sure they have the resources that they need, and if they don't know, they know who they can go to. So these small businesses know what they need, and these are homes. So they're homes and businesses, and some of them found new homes, and some of them had to move out of the community.
Let's talk about some of the horror stories. So, Michael, you're talking about here are the products that you use, here are the codes that can be adopted. Where does the blowback come from with communities?
Well, first, let me contextualize this for a moment, and let's put it in terms of housing supply, given where we are and who else is in the room. There's a study that came out in 2023 that determined that the equivalent of 1 month's worth of new construction in this country is destroyed by natural disasters every year, which is to say we lose 1 month of annual building of not enough supply every year because of natural disasters. So this is a human disaster. This is a community disaster. This is also a huge problem from a housing supply lens. And there's a very natural desire, and I think one of my panelists, co-panelists said this, build back quickly, as fast as you can, the same way. I want back what I had.
Yeah.
And earlier today, I don't know how many people in the room may know Andy Neal. He used to be the chief actuary of the NFIP, but I heard him on a panel, and he called the period after disasters a moment of plasticity, which, if anybody knows Andy, is very on brand. And which is to say, it's a moment when we can actually make changes. But it's also a moment where there is a very strong gut level desire to not make changes. So I want to use Altadena just as an example of what can go right and wrong and how we can get beyond it. In California, there is a WUI code, a Wildland Urban Interface code, that puts a higher level of building protections and defensible space protections if you are in what is considered a high risk, I won't get into the various classifications, but a higher risk area for wildfire. Well, Altadena, part of Altadena was mapped as the WUI and therefore had these higher level code requirements. A larger chunk of Altadena was not, which is to say when Altadena is being rebuilt, part of it will be built by law to these higher levels of code requirements. A larger chunk of it will not. So, even before we get to the disaster, before we get to the wildfire, the conflagration, choices made, policy choices, mapping choices, and then local choices to not voluntarily apply those same WUI codes to a broader chunk of the community are impacting how we're going to rebuild. So then we go from a posture of, well, we're going to be rebuilding this community to the higher standards to we're going to be rebuilding a part of this community to the higher standards. The other part is they're going to have to figure it out on their own if they want to voluntarily do it. And there are a lot of organizations that are doing yeoman's work to try to educate, to try to give tools. In LIA, there is the Foothills catalog. There is case study folks that are creating almost Sears catalogs of building plans. They're working with IBHS so that those plans are all including the higher levels of wildfire resilience. There are groups that are trying to help put together the financial picture to help people go beyond what their insurance claims are to get to those higher levels when it's not required by code. This is happening, but there is a need to do this because decisions were made before the disaster to separate out the community of Altadena into risk and no risk in ways that we're now ruining. I want to compare that to Santa Rosa, California, where after the Camp Fire, they rebuilt not just the same way. They actually rebuilt bigger homes closer together, which is to say that those neighborhoods are now at higher risk of wildfire than they were before they burned down. So we have this tendency of, well, we want people to come back. We want the families to come back. We want to get the tax base back. Let's help them come back by offering them opportunities to expand the footprint on their small lot. But that's at the risk of now we have elevated wildfire risk. I'm thinking more about this structurally, Marion, but I think there are things we can do beforehand and things that we too often see after the fact where we are sacrificing safety and resilience at the altar of expediency or a perception that, well, we want to give people something back because of this terrible thing that they experienced, which, while natural, is pretty counterproductive.
But at its very best, the built environment that we have represents the best guess somebody 50 years ago or 100 years ago about not just what they needed right now, but what you would need in the life of the structure. And at its worst, it's just about right now. Like you're saying Santa Rosa, right? They just built for right now. They don't care about the future. But at its best, you're just going to sit there and you're going to say, okay, so what got destroyed was everybody's best guess about today. In low and moderate income areas, by the way, not a very good fit most of the time for what the world we actually have. But today we can do a better job of saying, okay, we can build for today. What do we need today? But what do we need for the life of the structure, 50 years to 100 years? What should we build it like? And that's part of the communications job, is asking the question, is this building, is this law answering the question of what do we need now and what do we need for the whole life of this built environment? And those kind of questions are typically asked routinely for infrastructure, for water and sewer infrastructure in particular, but also for electrical infrastructure, and they are not asked for housing. Unless your insurance company is digging in on you, they're just not asked. Insurance companies are increasingly going, look, we have to convince our reinsurer. They'll ask multifamily that housing, but single family is still out there loose in the woods, man. Personally, I would never build a house that I couldn't answer that question for. Like, will it last its entire useful life given this situation here?
And that's definitely true for childcare as well. And so I would say one thing not to do is don't not listen to the double negative, other data that tells you this is how you need to prioritize these kinds of resources where infrastructure should be more resilient. We've done extreme weather maps in Houston and in New York City that show in 2050 a good part, not even necessarily with a disaster, but just with 30 years of time, 20, 30 years of time, a majority of the basement apartments in Brooklyn that operate family childcare out of the basement will be underwater. will be flooded or will be constantly flooded. So that's something to really think about if you want to keep up the supply of childcare or maintain housing. These are single-family homes. You need to make sure that you're addressing this. In Houston, in Harris County, they asked us to overlay childcare supply data with climate risk data, extreme weather risk data, to find out, should we prioritize this part of the city or this part of the city for some of these facilities funds for childcare providers? And we had to give them the bad news that 98% of all of the childcare providers in Houston were at above average risk for some kind of extreme weather event. So it's kind of like you need to do it in the whole county. But you need to pay attention and go like, oh, that means we should be allocating more funding to make sure that these programs are either more resilient or relocated, or you need to pay attention and actually act on those things.
Okay, we've got a ton of questions coming in, so
Great.
Almost lightning round to get through all these. So Jessie, let's start with you. So first question, worst things that can be said after a disaster to individuals.
We will make you whole. The single worst thing, once I had to deal with a disaster where a president went and did that. The worst. You will not be making every individual whole. Don't say it. Set expectations conservatively. We're going to work together on this recovery. We are going to help make a path for everybody who wants to be part of the recovery to be part of the recovery. We want to be safer next time. We're going to go as fast as we can, but here's our resource constraints. You have to talk like a rational person in a really tough environment where the amygdala hijack's going on. Never say we're going to make you whole.
And elected officials often will want to make those promises about time frame. I know probably every disaster-impacted community I've ever been to, and there have been a lot of them over the years, someone has said, if I'd known how long this recovery is going to take, I would have made different decisions.
Well, they're still finishing up at ground zero. Just saying.
Yeah, 2001, long time ago now. Okay, Jessie, this one's definitely for you. How can we talk about issues surrounding natural disasters long-term without including the word climate in the conversation?
It's just a thing, right? I mean, it's one of many, many, many risks. Buildings burn down. Buildings have obsolescence. They can be affected by disasters that are driven by climate. You don't have to say climate to say hurricanes happen here. To say, hi, meet my insurance company. They're worried about these things and how we're protecting from them. You can say we want to be more resilient. We want to be future ready. Future ready is working right now pretty well. The language is just going to shift and shift and shift. One of the biggest disasters happening right now is hail. It's punching through roofs in the Midwest. The fortified standard is helping. Fortified roofs are helping some where people are putting them in. So you have to use the language that works. I've always been unrepentant about that. When long ago Marion was my boss, I had to convince her that we had to talk both ways. We had to talk about climate change to people who wanted to talk data and climate change, and we had to talk about being future ready and being secure and financially resilient where that worked. I don't care about the language so long as the human result is thriving human communities that work and work for the long haul.
Everybody wants those.
Everybody wants those. We can agree on that. Find the lowest common denominator that actually is makes sense.
And I'll say IBHS works all over the country, and we work successfully in red states and blue states. We are a nonpartisan organization that is selling a not partisan message. Survivability and insurability are things that everybody cares about on a deeply human kitchen table kind of way.
Right.
And politics, yes, of course, legislation needs to be passed and the like, but it is thus far not a politicized issue, to the better for everyone, I think.
Okay, let's talk about affordability. So how should we be thinking about adopting higher codes or standards, moving the National Flood Insurance Program to higher risk-based rates when we know that so many Americans are struggling with the costs that they have now?
We have a lot of nice to haves in our building codes, and we have a lot of nice to haves in our, unbelievably inefficient permitting processes and planning processes. And you have to say, we're going to do the code changes that protect human health and safety and make our structures work the way they're supposed to work for their lives, and get rid of all this extra nice to have stuff that we do. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I happen to live in a building that got green taped. It was a blighted area being redeveloped, and the county threw away a ton of stuff that was just nice to haves in their normal permitting process. And our building is the first LEED Silver multifamily building in the United States. It's functional more of the time than the buildings around us. It's a wonderful place to live. I'm still there 20 years later. Nothing went wrong with the community because they got rid of a ton of the red tape, and the county learned from that. Maybe not enough yet, but I mean, there's just a lot of, to get rid of some costs, get rid of some of the extra stuff that's all nice to have that you don't need, and focus on what is going to make the community a good place to live for the long haul.
Yeah. And let me say yes and to that. We have a tendency to think about affordability, particularly in the home ownership context, of the price on the day that you buy. I don't know about you. I think about home ownership costs as the monthly payment I make every year to my mortgage servicer, which is the principal, the interest, insurance, and the property tax. And so I think we need to think more holistically about home ownership and affordability, where we don't just say, okay, we're going to not have a code, or we're going to keep the code back at 2005 level requirements in the name of affordability. But what that does is it just imposes much higher long-term operating costs on the owners. And that's a different kind of affordability challenge that is not discussed enough, I think, in this town in particular.
Okay, last question. The Congress, the Senate, has passed the Road to Housing bill, hooray, which includes permanent authorization of HUD's long-term disaster recovery program, CDBG-DR. Thoughts on why this would be beneficial for communities?
Well, I've written versions of that law since 2005. So the one biggest predictor after social cohesion of whether you're going to have a disaster recovery is certainty of the resources that you're going to have to run your recovery. It doesn't actually matter as much how much money you get. You don't necessarily have to have 100% of need met to drive an actual community-wide recovery. But you do need to know the resources are coming soon enough after the event that you can get going and not lose more ground even than the disaster caused. So certainty matters. Does it have to be at HUD? No. I never thought that even when I was at HUD.
We don't have to go there. Thanks.
Yeah, we have a little difference.
We're in the red. So, all right. Thank you, Jessie. Go ahead, Angie.
I just wanted to end on a positive note that for Ms. Beasley's family childcare, she actually got into a new location, and she's super grateful to be able to do that. And these are pictures of her new location. So knowing the resources you have to get back into business is super important.
And I just wanted to throw out a toolkit for anyone who operates affordable housing or multifamily housing. Enterprise Community Partners has something called the Ready to Respond toolkit. And within that, there's a comms toolkit. So take a look at that on enterprisecommunity.org. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There, you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.